Hi, everyone. I chose a couple of images which I thought would continue and maybe derail the conversation we were having last time with the images that Kostis had selected that I think raised the question of the original event, the indexicality of the photograph, the archive, the monumentality of the past. So the images I chose were firstly the juxtaposition of an image that I took, I think, in 1983, which is an old silver gelatin print of the former zamindar of the village in central India. I suppose the photograph is circa 1940, and it was silver gelatin print pasted on a board. It was very tatty, and which has now, I believe, disappeared. I mean, it no longer exists, but the information from that image still survives in the other part of that first slide, which shows Kubchand, the ex-zamindar, with his wife, Kesabai, in photoshopped form. So what I wanted to get us to think about was the movement from the original archival image to the photoshopped contemporary image. So what we're looking at on the right is what is still on public display in a village home. And I'm interested in the trajectory there from the original 1940s image, what we might think of as the archival image, to its contemporary incarnation. I would say that in between it's kind of morphed probably through half a dozen intermediary incarnations of being repainted and then photoshopped, continually upgraded every few years. So I'm interested in that progression and the corresponding disinterest in preserving the original moment. So my understanding is that in certain respects, this is almost the inverse of what we were discussing in the Cretan context. And then the other image shows a rural woman holding two images of deceased relatives, her husband and her son, who died at a very early age, and wanting these to be rephotographed. And this really serving to materialize the idea that the camera can improve the original photographic image. So I suppose this is another way of thinking about the status of the archival original image and its potential. And what interests me is the thought that the original is not the final limit of information or potential, which I think is the kind of archival understanding in a Euro-American context, but that the original is a starting point. I mean, it's almost as though, one could think of Benjamin talking about the ways in which the camera reveals new facets of the world. It's the idea behind holding up these images for the camera is, it almost suggests that the camera can upgrade, can take these images into a new dimension, so that what you get is not a slightly degraded copy of the original, but a step on the path to continual improvement.
I think your first remarks, Chris, about the Photoshop prompt some very important methodological questions also, to do with the particularities of each Photoshop. So rather than talking about Photoshopping as a general departure from the original event, there might be cases like the one that you're showing here, where actually Photoshopping enhances the original by multiplying and by replicating. And I can think of Cretan examples of this sort too, where an original image has been transferred into other contexts with the help of Photoshop. But then I can also think of other examples of Photoshopping in Crete, where people would definitely have objections to, because they violate the original. So it's Photoshopping, but it's a Photoshopping that's perceived as a violation of the original context, because it sort of tweaks the details, because it does something with the details that is considered inappropriate, color, or changing the elements that locals think are important to the image. So my first sort of methodological thought would be this: should we be talking about photoshopping as a general practice that departs from the original, or can there be various different versions of this, some of which enhance the original event?
Well, I suppose the other thing to say is that photoshopping builds upon practices of overpainting, so that there's a kind of missing intermediary space here, which is decades of overpainting photographs to bring out details that were otherwise hidden in the photograph. But I think you're absolutely right, Kostis, that photoshopping forces us to confront the idea that everything is contained in its most perfect form in the original index, and that any subsequent intervention will be a degradation. And so Photoshop, in a sense, shows that rural woman holding those images of her relatives is not misguided. She understands that camera technologies can bring out. I mean, obviously, that one of the things they can easily do is increase the size of the image, but they can increase contrast, clarity, acuity. So there are all kinds of other enhancements that are now, well, I think have always been possible through overpainting and now possible through digital technologies.
I think for me, it also brings to mind the fact that maybe was overlooked, and you've mentioned it, Chris, of the fact of how the archive is perceived is in terms of it being a Euro-American construct from the Euro-American perspective of an archive. So we talk about originals, but maybe the original is not the original photograph, right? So maybe the original is actually that conjuncture that happens in the event of photography. So then if that's the case, then the original is not the silver gelatin print. I'm just thinking about my field site when people are saying the photographs are always speaking. What I've been reflecting upon is that that voice is attached to the living person, and the fact that there's a temporal continuity in which is, I wouldn't say it's just guided by affect, by the actual emotions of love or care, but it has a sort of a phenomenological, metaphysical way of understanding the world. So there is, if you look at this photograph, I'm thinking of Strassler's phrase of demanding images. There's also maybe a demand from the image to have that awareness that care is needed. So these are also practices of care. It's not just of enhancement. It's also saying it could be, I mean, it's really visible in, this triptych you've got, which shows this element of that the presence and vitality of that person is also about of this moment, as well as connecting back to the actual event of photography. That's what it brought to my mind in terms of thinking about my own work in Nigeria.
Yeah, I think that's very insightful, Nalu. But it makes me think also that, maybe that distinction that Azulay makes between the event of the photograph and the event of photography is useful here. So that the original image, the 1940s image, which has now, essentially been thrown away because it was no longer needed. That sort of what in a Euro-American context, what one, might frame museologically as the original archival image, that could stand in for the event of the photograph, the kind of origin point. And what one sees in the other images is a much greater concern with the event of photography as a kind of rolling frontier of endless engagement with the image. And it's that continually moving point that concerns people as the focus of their engagement, rather than this kind of museological obsession with origins. I mean, I think it is puzzling to villagers why I would be interested in that old original image clapped out. I mean, you see the same thing with when temples are refurbished. Often I find myself kind of lamenting some beautiful little shrine under a banyan tree is being demolished and replaced with, sanitary white tiles, glazed tiles. So the kind of archaic, picturesque original seems to have been bulldozed in favor of this clinical, much more efficient, purer structure. So it's partly aesthetics, but I think it's also a clash of temporality, or to use that Thomas Troutman term, a clash of chronicities.
I'm also struck with Kostis' the fact when you've talked about that your own interlocutors really respecting the original and holding that kind of sacrosanct. Also in Nigeria, the originals are very, there's maybe a type of mythology around them. There is, for example, I can give an example from which I'm still working through in the field work of how Simple Photo really feels so strongly about his role as a custodian for these originals, and even showing some of them to me, he's like, you can look at it, but you can't re-photograph it. You can't take it away. So I think that kind of also, for my own work, contradicts also this changing the original and improving it in some way aesthetically to match the current, the current fashions.
Mm-hmm. So you're suggesting that Yoruba photography kind of stands midway between the Cretan fascination with the authority of the original and the Indian disinterest in the original.
Well, I think it's also a reflection, maybe for me, what I'm thinking about is it's a deeper reflection of what happens, sort of thinking about things like Homi Bhabha's thinking about hybridity and mimicry, and just thinking what happens when another cultural way of seeing and way of value impacts another society. And I think photography is one way that sort of intersections of, because as some things are running parallel in the field in terms of both aesthetics of value and modernities, in the plural sense.
There's an interesting discussion to which we could juxtapose what you said, Chris, about the Benjaminian showing, because essentially with your examples, you're pointing to a departure to the indexicality as a form of resistance. So in other work, you have shown, and also in my work as well, that by looking at the original inscription in the image, there can be information lodged in there which can go against the grain of the archival inscription. So a postcard photographer wants to frame the savages, but then the way the savages look at the camera in the example you used from Sudan is actually problematizing the photographer's intention and his primitivism. And I have tons of examples like that in Sfakia. So with what you are describing here, you're kind of pointing to the fact that going beyond that indexicality, what Benjamin called the tiny spark, there are other forms of political possibilities which are more from below, more from the uses, more from the. So I'm just.
I think that's a great comment, but that's where I think maybe what one needs to underline the ritual uses of these photographic images or images based in photography of ancestors. So that one way of approaching it, thinking about that question of Benjaminian contingency, would be that this is a process of stripping away the contingencies of the event. I mean, it's a way of reducing the exorbitance of the original image to make it more assimilable to the repetitions of ritual action. So that makes me think of Partha Chatterjee's arguments about nationalist imagery and how photographic images in India often get turned into non-photographic forms, into kind of icons or logos, and that part of what's involved there is a thinning of the exorbitance of a dealing with the recalcitrance of the original image to make it more adaptable for political or here for ritual usage.